Hello, everybody. Really excited to be joining you all. I am CJ Gerard. I am a senior strategy manager at Accenture, but really what that actually means is for the last, 15 years or so, I've been working with companies to help them look at their supply chains. And I've been on the finance side, so the investor side, as well as sitting within the companies themselves. And I particularly focus on agricultural value chains, but very excited to talk with you all today.
Hey everyone, I'm Tab Dayani. I'm a sustainability strategy manager at Accenture based out of Chicago in the US. Also specialize in supply chain, responsible sourcing and procurement. More specifically, that means helping organizations reduce their GHG emissions, improve efficiency, and help make the business case for sustainability and sustainable value chain transformation. We often see sustainability used as like a hot buzzword, but I'm a big fan of the Sustainable Development Goals because they help break down sustainability into more tangible goals and guiding principles for business transformation, as well as humanity's path forward to a brighter future. Accenture has been a trusted partner of the UN Global Compact for the 3 years of running this program. So we're excited to speak with you today and definitely exciting to see people from all over the place on this call. So yeah, excited to jump into it with y'all. Cool. I'll quickly walk through the agenda for today's session. So we'll be sure to cover the background and emerging supply chain themes. So what does that mean in terms of overall core pressures from a business point of view on the supply chain? We'll go through a quick impact example, as well as talk about how does sustainability fit into the value chain and what is the Sustainable Development Goals elements of the sustainable value chain. We also want to talk about core theories. So what are those key steps for a sustainable value chain transformation? First, if we define what a sustainable value chain is, understand the challenges and complexities involved, and then go over the key 4 transformation steps, which we can see below, right? Commit, assess, define, and implement. And we will define those a little bit more in detail in just a moment for you all. And we'll also be sure to have a final Q&A at the end. But like Caitlin said, we want this to be as interactive as possible. We'll be doing some surveys through this app called Menti at critical points in the conversation as well. But we also want to make sure to use that Q&A function. If you have questions at any point during the presentation, we're happy to field questions live as they come in, incorporate them into the overall flow of the conversation. So look forward to hearing from y'all throughout this discussion. All right. So after the session, you will have developed an understanding of the key drivers of working towards the sustainable value chain, an understanding of those key steps involved from how to get from point A to point B in that sustainable value chain transformation, as well as an understanding of the key focus areas and tools that you can utilize as part of that transformation process. In terms of capabilities, you'll be able to communicate the value you can unlock through a focus on sustainable value chain. We know this to be true, and you all do too, but sustainability is much more than just environmental benefits. It has a lot of tangible business benefits in a traditional sense as well. You can also utilize a consistent framework for these implementation projects across your supply chain, and you'll be able to start assessing the priority areas, hotspots, and relevant tools for that sustainable value chain improvement and transformation. So I'll kick it over to CJ to talk a little bit about the why.
Perfect. So I'll start us at a low point so that Tab can then just bring us up with his solutions. But, really, we're facing a series of pressures that's really creating urgency. And I like to think about it in 3 layers. So the first layer is really about this shifting focus. So you have investors and consumers asking questions about things that maybe you weren't responsible for understanding or knowing before. So that's creating just a new sense of awareness that hasn't necessarily been in our purview. The second is around the operating environment. So when you have regulation starting to have teeth, this is no longer something that you voluntarily sign up to, but you're actually going to start facing fines and consequences for not being compliant. It changes the way you think about some of these sustainability topics. And on top of that, the environmental economist in me is very excited to say that all these things that were considered external are now internal. So things like carbon, water, the way that we treat our forests and our plants, those are starting to have a price and carry a financial element to them. And the final thing to think about when you're talking about pressures is also then the pressure that places on employees and executives. So rather than it sitting over there in the CSR department and kind of more non-profit focused, every employee and executive is responsible for understanding what their role is in sustainability, and actually want to contribute, right? They consider that part of the reason that they show up for work. So I want to give a quick example of agricultural value chains, and not to go too much deeper into a low point. I kind of get the bummer slides. But what I want to make a point here is to say that I think when we think about sustainable value chains, sometimes we have a tendency to think about the impacts that climate and sustainability are now having on our supply chains. So when you think about drought or more extreme rainfall, you think, oh gosh, yeah, that's going to impact our ability to harvest tomatoes, and oh, that's going to impact our ability to get the finished good over to the grocer. But I also want us to think about the cascading impacts. So not just about what climate change and what some of these changing circumstances are doing to our supply chains, but what happens when our supply chains break down, what that does to society. So if you can't harvest tomatoes, you can't grow tomatoes, that's a food security issue. If you can't get tomatoes from the field to a processing plant, that's impacting livelihoods, that's impacting farmer livelihoods. So I just want us to also keep in mind that we're not just talking about supply chains and the roles that they play for our company, but we're also talking about what they do in terms of the way that we've set up our lives. And the final thing is talking about the SDGs and the role that supply chains have in us really accomplishing these goals. And I think, the UN General Secretary, unfortunately, at COP27, had to say, hey, I think it was tremendously off track. So one of the things that I want to say is, it's going to continue, these issues are going to compound. So for example, water risk, where 1/3 is currently living in high risk water areas, 2/3 in 2025. There are also just small incremental things though, that we can enable through supply chains that will make massive differences, like greater distribution of energy efficiency, light bulbs or solar. I mean, these are things that can not only make our businesses run better, but they can also ultimately save lives. You're talking about alternatives like burning coal or other harmful substances. So I'll leave us there with a bit of sense of urgency, a bit of the pressures, and I'll hand it back over to Tab to really talk about what we can do within our supply chains to start addressing some of these risks and also harnessing some of those opportunities.
Absolutely. That's a really good outline, CJ, and a really good primer for the discussion that we're about to dive into. But before we hear more from me, we'd love to hear a little bit from you all. So based on those sustainable development goals, based on even beyond that, the different types of value drivers that you see in your own value chains, what are some of the high impact opportunities that you see when it comes to creating a sustainable supply chain? Now, if we go to the next slide, we'll be able to see how to use Menti. So if you haven't used Menti before, don't worry, it's super simple. If you have your phone, you can scan that QR code on the screen and it'll take you right to the webpage. Alternatively, if you want to go on your laptop, navigate to menti.com and use the code that you see on the screen. You'll be able to see the question there, type it in. And just as a note, don't close it out because we'll be using Menti at various junctures throughout the conversation to kind of get your input and sort of relay that so we take it beyond just the theoretical and we can start to see and start to comment on how we can help you all apply it to your everyday operating context within your business. Cool. And I think we can drop the Menti info in the chat as well. Let me see if I can do that. Yeah. So what are some of the high impact opportunities that you see when it comes to creating a sustainable supply chain? CJ, as we maybe wait for some answers to filter in, any comments on this question from your end?
There's so many. Oh, my favorite, circularity. Yes, absolutely. And I think that goes in hand with reducing waste, but also, circularity has so many exciting potential new business models, which I think is exciting. So not only thinking about circularity in terms of, having responsible diversions of waste, but also how can that unlock new products? And yes, definitely reducing waste. I know you're going to be into the suppliers one, Tab.
Oh yeah. Supply chain procurement guy, definitely into suppliers. There's so much we can do through our supply chains to engage our value chain partners and help them, motivate them to begin their sustainability journey as well. Seen a lot of really good stuff about the S of the ESG, environmental social governance, around eradicating modern slavery, having living wages. Yeah, the human inputs into our value chain. Well, I guess even the way I just said it there, right? Human inputs into a value chain almost makes it sound like so impersonal. But through the sustainable value chain, we can kind of rediscover that human element and really treat people like people. So that's definitely another huge goal of the sustainable value chain transformation. Yeah, a lot of
and we'll be talking through traceability, which I think is a really good one for modern slavery and living wages in particular. So excited to get to that section and hear folks' thoughts on that topic. December Another common response we saw in the morning session was around emissions. As a decarbonization guy, that definitely got me going as well. But emissions, waste reduction, all of those things are definitely huge value adds that come from the sustainable supply chain. And we'll talk a little bit about how not only is it good from a responsible business perspective, but also from a traditional business perspective, from a bottom line perspective. A lot of times these sustainability oriented outcomes actually go hand in hand with those typical business drivers as well. Cost of fuel.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and navigate back to the slides, and we can start to talk through a little bit about how all of these sort of input into the sustainable value chain. Yeah. So as we can see from your answers, from some of the objective displayed here, what are some of these key characteristics of a sustainable value chain? As we can see, you sort of use the sustainable development goals as a guiding principles as to how you can add value for the various stakeholder groups that CJ discussed previously, right? Our partners, our consumers, our investors, et cetera. Enabling sustainability actually enables so many beneficial advantages for the overall business, for those overall stakeholders based on their priorities. So if we want to double click into some of those key characteristics of a sustainable value chain, we have traceability through supplier relationships to transmit desired information from the origin to consumers and beyond. Not only is that crucial for changing consumer preferences and increased pressure for consumers to know, hey, where are the things that I'm buying? Where are they coming from? Can I certify that they are responsibly created, responsibly sourced? But not only that, it helps you get visibility into your data and where your materials are coming from too. A huge win-win. Proactive elimination of human rights abuses, compulsory labor, and discrimination from your supply chain. Yeah, we saw a lot of responses around those in the Menti, right? Sustainable value chain is huge for making sure that we treat people like people and make sure that all labor is adhering to responsible standards and making sure there are no violations or anything from that perspective. We also have sort of the tech and energy element of it. So AI empowered manufacturing, using renewable energy to power your business, and having an upskilled labor force, also a crucial part of sustainable value chain, as well as sustainably sourced ingredients that regenerate the land or are depleted at a rate aligned with carrying capacities. So making sure that our land use, like CJ mentioned, with our water use, our deforestation becoming more and more of a critical issue. How do we make sure that we are good stewards of the land and using resources at a responsible rate? As we can see, sustainability encompasses the different value chain inputs across direct materials to indirect materials to labor and technology, taking a holistic view across all of those elements and really defining how sustainability applies to each one of those pieces within the overall value chain. So the supply chain by nature is really complex, especially in today's day and age, right? And because of that complexity, you'll have different stakeholder groups asking different questions at different points in the value creation process, right? From the beginning of the process, designing, sourcing, creating a product to the end of its life. If there are reverse logistics, take back loops, or recycling elements involved, there are going to be different elements of sustainability that embed into those different processes. And those different stakeholder groups are going to be asking different sets of questions, right? So if we take a look at, for example, marketing, right? They might be asking, hey, how do we make sure to label our products so that consumers know what they're buying? How do we make sure that those products are meeting certain standards? Design and engineering stakeholders might ask, hey, if we want to understand and design products that are low materials use, low emissions, how can we do a life cycle analysis of our products and understand the true ESG impact associated? Procurement people might be asking, hey, how do I get that visibility into my supplier network, the environmental impact of my first tier supplier network, but even beyond that? So my suppliers' supply chains, how are they functioning? How can I get visibility beyond just the first level of my purchased goods and services? And in manufacturing, you might be asking, hey, how do you deal with making sure that your energy consumption is optimized and you're using renewable energy to power the value creation that you're making? While this does seem complex at first, understanding the different priorities of those internal stakeholders can help manage that complexity and really break it down into digestible pieces that can then sort of be used to get that stakeholder buy-in across your organization. So when taking on this sustainable value chain transformation, we can pretty much distill it down into these 5 guiding questions. So number 1 is, how can we enable that end-to-end visibility across our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions to drive sustainable impact? And when we're looking at that end-to-end visibility, obviously that encompasses our own operations, but it also encompasses outside of our operations where we have influence, right? What about the operations of our suppliers? And a quick aside, for those unfamiliar with scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, scope 1 emissions are basically the emissions from a company's owned assets. So the direct emissions from facilities, either offices or manufacturing, or fleet and vehicles. Scope 2 emissions come from purchased electricity and energy. And scope 3 is all of the other indirect emissions from your value chain. So your purchased goods and services from your suppliers, anything having to do with upstream or downstream distribution, the emissions associated with the end of life, anything like that. So that's all scope 3. And that sort of encompasses, hey, internal operations as well as the impact that you have outside of your own operations. So that's number 1. Number 2 is, how do we prioritize and commit to advancing decent work in our supply chain and mitigating additional ESG risks? So when we think about the environmental, social, and governance impacts that your organization has, how do we make sure from a labor perspective, from environmental perspectives, you're making sure you understand the impact and you're mitigating the risks associated from your value chain? Number 3 is, how do we drive resource efficient business models and ecosystems? Sustainability and efficiency go hand in hand. Optimizing the resources used, optimizing the energy used, obviously has huge sustainability implications as well as traditional business implications. Number 4 is how do we connect innovation and consumption to capitalize on the sustainability transition? With all the emerging trends, with shifting consumer preferences, you want to make sure those are accounted for in your overall vision, in your transformation goals. And number 5, last but not least, is how do we accelerate and steer our sustainability transformation enabled by technology and data? Having that data is really crucial to validating the impact, measuring the performance, ensuring that you're achieving the outcomes that are desired, so that visibility and embedding technology is also really important. Cool. So as we take a look at those 4 steps, this is sort of the framework that we'll be focusing on for the rest of the presentation. So if you take a look at that first one, committing, when we look at setting a North Star, you want a vision and priorities that are clear, complete, and reflective of the key factors, the key industry impacts, as well as your organization's landscape and context. You want to make sure it reflects the priorities of your different stakeholders as well. So when you commit to setting goals, you're kind of setting that where do you want to be? The next step being assess. When you set where you want to be, you also need to assess point A, where you currently are, right? You do that through establishing baseline data, as well as determining the scope of effort. So the scope of impact that your organization has, as well as the sphere of influence that you can reasonably have over your operations. So after you find point A, assess, you have your North Star when you've committed to your goals. Well, how do you define a roadmap to get from point A to point B? Through establishing procurement standards and process improvements, as well as in communicating these expectations internally within your organization, as well as externally to your suppliers and other stakeholders. And then after you have that roadmap to get from point A to point B, how do you actually implement it? So how do you actualize, create project plans, and prioritize different sets of improvements across the supply chain and embed technology so that you have that traceability and data visibility end-to-end across your supply chain in your organization? So let's double click on that first module of committing. So when you commit to set your sustainable value chain transformation goals, there's sort of 2 key components. You want to make sure to be able to build the business case so that you get the buy-in of your internal stakeholders, as well as establish a vision that is consistent with not only your organization, but the sustainable development goals, as well as the visions of your investors and other third-party stakeholders. We'll also talk about a science-based targets case study where an organization was able to use this framework to set goals around their carbon emissions, which is a priority for pretty much every large business nowadays. Cool. So when we take a look at building the business case, we want to understand the landscape of your business, both internally and externally. Now, if we look at those panels on the left, where it says initial risk analysis and benchmarking against peer companies, these are almost standard, hey, this is what you'd want to do for any transformation project, not even necessarily specifically a sustainable transformation project, right? When you're doing that initial risk analysis, taking a look at what are you sourcing and where from, what are your key products and services, and what are the risks associated with those products and services? So that's getting a sense of your internal landscape. But then also benchmarking against peer companies, getting a sense of that external landscape, your industry operating context. What are your peers doing to advance their sustainable supply chain goals? What have they done that's worked for them? What governance structures have they put in place to help manage that transition? And then when we take a look at that, how do we embed sustainability into that overall building the business case for sustainable value chain transformation? Well, when we look at those risks and opportunities, we can kind of find that, as CJ spoke about, right, the business faces so many challenges from regulatory and consumer shifts to costs to pretty much everything, right? So we can see that when we embed sustainability into the risk and opportunity assessment, we can address goals like avoiding reputational risk, complying with reporting regulation, improving overall efficiency and supply chain resiliency, as well as driving opportunities in the way of reducing costs through realizing efficiencies, generating existing product improvements, and even leading to long-term growth through product innovation and existing product improvements. So now that we've understood how to establish the business case, how do we establish a vision and make sure to get that buy-in from all of our stakeholders? So if we look at these three key elements across risk analysis, investors, and stakeholder buy-in, when we take a look at risk analysis, we want to understand where does your business, based on its operating context, based on its processes, based on its supply chain, what are the key environmental, social, and governance impacts that are felt from those operations? Where does the business have those impacts within its value chains and systems? And that can sort of help inform where your goals should be targeting, right? There are a lot of industry-specific frameworks out there that can help sort of provide that level set if you're not really sure where to start. And we'll touch a little bit on those later in the presentation. Next, when you take a look at your investor priorities, how can you demonstrate commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, but also make sure that you are true to the vision of your own organization, as well as the goals of your investors? So you want to be able to assure investors of your commitment to sustainability. Bloomberg predicts that ESG assets are on track to reach $53 trillion by 2025. ESG-based investment portfolios are heavily on the rise, sort of correlating with that sustainable investment trend that you see. And ESG ratings can actually affect the cost of capital provided by investors. That's increasingly a key metric that they use to price the cost of capital as they invest in businesses. Now, as you've considered your investor perspective, you also need to get the buy-in from the other stakeholders across your value chain. So beyond investors, suppliers, customers, how do you make sure that your vision reflects their inputs and priorities along with those of shareholders? And this ensures that your vision is aligned with your holistic set of partners across the supply chain. So now let's get into a quick case study on how AstraZeneca was able to set goals around their carbon reduction through the SBTI, which stands for Science-Based Targets Initiative. Basically, the company launched its Ambition Zero Carbon program in 2020 with the goal of reducing its absolute Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions by 98% by 2026. In 2021, they were actually able to make significant strides against that goal and reduce their Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 59%. They did this through activities like sourcing 100% of their imported electricity from renewables. And to deliver on their overall goal, they also have initiatives in place to reduce their overall energy consumption, so increase their energy efficiency, as well as transition to overall 100% renewable energy and transition to an electric vehicle fleet. Now, part of the challenge in realizing their goal is that Scope 1 and 2 emissions are much more, I guess, directly addressable and within the purview of the organization. But Scope 3 emissions, while requiring a little bit more creative strategies to engage and partner with suppliers to create those emissions reductions, they also represent over 95% of the corporate emissions and are not as easily directly addressable as Scope 1 and Scope 2. So the company, because it's such a significant impact, wanted to set a target to reduce their absolute Scope 3 emissions by 50% by 2030 on the way to setting overall 1.5 degree climate change aligned targets, reducing their emissions 90% by 2045. And you'll see a lot of organizations do this where they will set intermediary targets on the way to an overall net zero target, typically by 2045, 2050. Accenture actually has their set by 2025. So that's a cool fact there. But in order to realize those scope 3 goals, they had to get creative through initiatives like ensuring 95% of their spend with their key suppliers is with companies who have also set similar targets and made similar commitments to the SBTI targets and carbon reduction, as well as taking specific looks at product-based innovations. For example, within inhalers, there was a specific propellant used that had a really high greenhouse gas emissions impact. And they realized that by making some products changes, they were actually able to make the product using a different propellant that was able to reduce the overall GHG impact of that product by 99.9%. So those types of innovative solutions are sort of more in line with what we see for organizations taking the charge in addressing their scope 3 emissions, as well as doing what they can to address their scope 1 and 2. So we want to take a pause here and pose a question to you all. So which goal that your company has already set has inspired you most? So any sustainability goals that you've seen your company set, even if you've seen ones, really ambitious ones that other companies have set. We'd love to hear from you on the Menti, which we will flash back on the screen in a moment. Yeah, net zero emissions by 2030. That's really ambitious, and that's a really good goal to have. We also often see goals around responsible land use, responsible water use and deforestation, things like sustainable packaging, labor and compliance, equity and inclusion. You have things like diversity and inclusion, not only with your suppliers, but also internally within your organization as well. Just as some additional examples, seeing a lot of other good ones trickling in here too. Yeah, living wage.
Fibers is a great one. Really thinking about, future-proofing our materials and ensuring that they're produced in a way that will continue to enable our production. It's a really good one.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are a lot of really interesting implications within sustainably created materials simply because of how much are consumed. And I think it's actually interesting when we look at the sustainably created materials in tandem with the circular supply chain innovations that companies are starting to explore, really creating almost like a truly low to zero impact on the environment while still being able to have all the materials we need to, I guess, have all the nice things we want. Very cool. Yeah, thanks for those answers and those responses. Definitely some inspiring visions and goals there. I'll kick it back to CJ to talk a little bit through the next step of assessing your current state.
Great, thanks, Tab. So, the kind of phrase I like to use is you don't really know how far you've gone unless you know where you're starting. And that's really the point of this assess phase. So it's to understand where you are as a baseline, and that can help you to prioritize where you need to invest and take action while also seeing the whole spectrum of what lies ahead of you. So in determining that scope, there is an inherent evaluation that's required because we don't have infinite resources, we don't have infinite time. And so we need to take frameworks and lenses so as to not be completely overwhelmed. And, I'll talk through both of those pieces and then try and kind of pull them together, talking through a materiality case study. And I'll also talk about kind of the importance of continuing to revisit. Our world is moving so quickly that what wasn't as material to your company, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, might have shifted pretty significantly. So we'll talk through how to make sure that you're continuing to keep this agile and then keep it really responsive to our changing and fluctuating circumstances. When you're thinking about establishing a baseline, it's really important to look at it from different angles. So, we have ESG as a framework, but I think it requires going a little bit further beyond to help us define what buckets or themes of sustainability we should be thinking about. From the social lens, looking at human rights, and I'll say a little bit about salience here once I've kind of finished the stakeholders and some of the sources of where we would kind of understand the different themes of sustainability. But I think social, the human rights and the impact to humans is really where you should be thinking about your business's impact. That's the primary perspective, right? Then there's a perspective around investors. What sort of metrics, what sort of transparency are they asking for? Are they requiring? And particularly, as Tab pointed out, this is a pretty large business impact as we're seeing sustainability topics be brought into risk assessments to determine your company's creditworthiness. So this can impact your bottom line in a pretty significant way if you don't have that transparency, that understanding from an investor lens. Frameworks and certifications can help to put definitions into focus so that we can all kind of speak a similar language. So if you're defining a bucket of a certain issue set, say emissions, something like scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, that can just help us so that we all kind of are on the same page in terms of our communication and how we're reporting out. Regulation and compliance, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, we're really starting to see this take hold in a significant way in terms of just your ability to operate. So that's another place to ensure that you're really clear, not just on the regulatory environment that your headquarters are in, but then also where your supply chain is. And that can get highly complex, particularly when we're talking about supply chains, because what you didn't necessarily think applied to you because your executive suite is in Switzerland, well, make sure that you're checking all the far reaches of your raw material sourcing as well. And then finally, the consumer pulse. So when you're thinking about, what is material to the company, also be thinking about that consumer lens and what they want to hear about, what they think, you should be held accountable for, and ensure that's part of this overall assessment of where you are today. Now, in terms of salience versus materiality, think of, we have our materiality grid, right? So you have your stakeholders that's usually on this axis, and then you have your impact to the business. Those are all really helpful to think about. When you talk about stakeholders, as Tab was saying, there's your suppliers, there's your customers, there's your employees, but there are some topics that they fundamentally matter. And when you're talking about human rights, I think this is particularly important. So whether or not you think that the violation of human rights is significant to your business or to the set of stakeholders you've chosen, those are just things that you as a company operating on this planet need to fully consider. So it's not from a specific perspective of a specific stakeholder. It's just what's right and what's wrong. So as we talk through materiality, think of materiality in a very holistic sense, including the salience of certain issues. Now, I will say there is a way to do materiality, and there is maybe a more holistic or thoughtful way to do materiality. So I'll talk through some of the differences here. And again, we're all learning, right? This is new to everyone. So I think it's important to understand where your company is in terms of their understanding of their impact. But I also will challenge you all to take a little bit further of a step each time you start to think about the materiality and assessing where you are as a company. So what we're fairly accustomed to at this point is you have this grid, you have the buckets of sustainability, and you put them on the grid and you put it in an investor report and you say, this is generally what we're really going to focus on. This is what it seems like we really should pay attention to. Now, what I would push you all to do, and I shouldn't be saying this because I'm a consultant, but don't outsource this. use this as an opportunity to engage throughout your organization and really get a fundamental understanding, not just you, but also other senior executives and employees in your company, of the role that they have to play in these topics. So when you're evaluating that impact to your business, you're evaluating it from a lens across the org. So there's already that buy-in, and there's also a built-in business case. So for example, when a procurement function is thinking about these buckets of sustainability, and they're thinking about, well, I really just want to make sure that surety of supply is there. I want to make sure that when I call up my supplier, they have the goods that I need ready. Well, yeah, that's great. And that's how you evaluate risk, and that's how you evaluate your priorities. But what are some of the sustainability issues that could prevent that supply from being there when you need it? And in that way, you're helping them to translate their priority into sustainability terms. And that's going to make that placement on the grid even more meaningful. Now, the second thing that I'll point out in terms of this kind of materiality plus or increasing the depth of your materiality assessment is this really a clear understanding of the impact that you're having across the board, and making sure that the documentation is really there. So as you're doing this exercise, it's not just a guess. You are surveying folks, or you're doing clear assessments. And this is probably where consultants would be helpful, is you're looking across the entire industry, right? To understand, where do we sit in this ecosystem? It's not just our business functioning by itself. Where are those farther reaching elements that we need to also be including as part of our responsibility? And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But I think I'll leave you with this point. It's when you have a materiality matrix and you're thinking about where you are today, it's critical to think about the broader business case of, what are we actually going to do about these buckets? The ones in this far right corner, they're going to require immediate action and immediate investment. And if you haven't been considering that from the start of this assessment, you're going to lose a lot of the information that was really necessary to collect, such as putting an actual quantification on how much this is going to cost the business if we don't have any action. And it's going to make that materiality matrix, or that end product, even more powerful as a tool to help you prioritize where you spend your resources and your time. So the next slide is really thinking about differentiating your approaches. So we talk about this upper right-hand quadrant, right? So this is high impact to your stakeholders. This is high impact to your business. However, even within that quadrant, there's going to be varying degrees of how much you're going to be able to affect change. So I often like to think of this kind of sphere of influence to say, what in that upper right quadrant is something that if I invest $1 into, we're going to get $2 back, because I'm going to see immediate change, I'm going to see immediate action, and this is going to have immediate returns for my company. It's good to know, and it's good to have a direct approach for some of those topics. But then there are those topics in that upper right-hand quadrant where some of us look at them and say, I'm not really sure what to do about that. And those are the kind of topics where you need to think about, hey, I might not have as much influence there. So I need to engage partners. I need to engage NGOs or local community groups. I need to engage my other peers, and we need to take collective action, because this is important for my business and my stakeholders, but this is also in everybody else's upper right-hand quadrant, and we all can't truly affect change individually, so we really need to partner. So by doing that exercise, once you have your material topics, you can start to create kind of these parallel roadmaps where you have different approaches for the different levels of influence that you have per topic or per bucket, we might say. Now, the case study that I just want to talk through is bringing back to that point of things change, and they change quickly. So Kraft Heinz materiality assessment, they do this refresh every 3 to 5 years. And this can drive sustainability professionals kind of crazy, right? Because you have this materiality matrix, and you set your roadmap, and you set your targets, and you have your investments in place, and then something shifts. And so do you have to throw everything out and you start over? Or are those investments still valid? Or do we continue making progress as we did? So I think one thing to think about with Kraft Heinz is they had this materiality matrix. When they redid it in 2020, human rights suddenly shifted up into that upper right-hand quadrant. And so there was a bit of reckoning to say, okay, what do we do now? You can look at certain frameworks, you can look at guidelines. So in this case, they looked at the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And they started to say, okay, this is something that matters greatly, but we might not have as much influence as we would want. So we're going to have to activate this through our suppliers. So they started designing supplier guidelines to ensure that alongside some of the other material topics, I mean, you have food safety and quality, that's going to be passed down to suppliers as well. So how can you ensure that then human rights is now potentially embedded in those contracts alongside food and safety, so that you're not only signaling to the market, hey, we understand human rights is really pivotal to our business, but you're also communicating that upstream so that your suppliers are getting that same indication, okay, things have shifted a bit and we are now held accountable to a different standard and to a different account, and things will have to adjust accordingly. And with that, I think we have another Menti. So which risk is the most material and relevant to your company? So again, thinking about that upper right-hand quadrant, what really matters to your stakeholders and what really matters to your business? And then I'll also maybe go off script a bit and ask folks to also reflect on some of those salient issues. So maybe something didn't land in that upper right-hand quadrant because of the way that perhaps you used a certain framework or perhaps you used a certain approach, but you feel is still vital to the company's ability to operate, as well as just the company's reputation. And I think the way that we all feel when we show up to a company to work. So we'll flip over to the Menti and get some of those results. What is most material? And I think a lot of the times we see emissions, and I think that's really a lot to what Tab was saying too, is when you look at kind of the overall cost of sustainability, we're starting to see fuel, we're starting to see carbon taxes, and the fact that folks are starting to buy offsets. So a lot of the times that ends up in that upper right-hand quadrant, just by nature of the cost of operating businesses that are high greenhouse gas emitters. Yes, a lot of people have very complex supply chains. I was talking to a company that was saying, hey, we've been working with about 200 suppliers to set SBTIs and set those science-based targets. And I said, God, that's incredible. So how many do you have left? And he said, 43,000. So it can be a little daunting.
It can. One thing I will say about the many suppliers challenge, which is definitely real and probably applicable to most of the people at most of the companies on this call. But one thing you'll probably notice too is if you do not only like an assessment of how much you are spending across your third-party spend, and the ESG impact across your third-party spend, you'll find that in both cases, typically actually 80% of your spend and 80% of that ESG impact is coming from maybe a handful of suppliers. Maybe it's only like 100 suppliers. So that does help sort of narrow it down when you're taking that lens of, oh, how do I start engaging with my suppliers? And we'll cover this a little bit later in the presentation too, but I'm seeing it here, so forgive me for jumping a little bit ahead. But when you're able to see that, you can sort of identify, hey, who do I need to prioritize partnering with if I have a limited amount of time and resources to, initiate this transformation, right? So that's just a note there. Seeing a little bit about decarbonization too, definitely a huge and material issue. CJ, I'd also be curious to hear about, so coming from an agriculture specialization, what were some of those key risks with regards to like water use, land use, or like chemicals and stuff that you saw during your time close to that industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of materiality for agriculture companies, we often see regenerative agriculture taking a huge spot in the materiality matrix. And I think what's critical about regenerative agriculture is, I always think about it kind of as a confluence of a lot of different topics. So there is the immediate kind of reversal of the detriment that we've had to our soil health because of the way that we've been scaling our production to kind of a commercial and harmful practices. But you also see then the potential benefit, which is what you would call an insetting approach, whereby instead of thinking about your supply chain as just being an emitter of carbon, you're thinking about regenerative agriculture and its ability and capacity to sequester more carbon in the soil. And so that often ends up in that high materiality matrix because it can both build resilience in your supply chain, but it can also help to offset some of the emission activity that takes place further downstream. So I think regenerative agriculture is definitely my favorite materiality topic in a lot of the agricultural materiality matrices that I see.
Yeah, that's a really interesting breakdown. I'm seeing a lot around cybersecurity and data privacy too. Definitely real and material for companies across a lot of industries. Anywhere where you're managing consumer data, financial data. I saw in the comments someone mentioned counterfeit drugs and patient data privacy. That's definitely huge. General organization cybersecurity. I think we start to see so many more. I'm gonna butcher the statistics, so I'm not even gonna attempt it. But cybercrime is on the rise by X%. You see so many more cyber hacks, especially for large companies trying to find sensitive information, not only to those companies' operations, but also to steal some of that sweet consumer data that we know is so treasured and protected for good reason, especially in light of new regulation for consumer data privacy protection, both in the EU and the US, as well as globally overall. So yeah, a lot of good risks being shown over here. Let's go ahead and toggle back to the presentation to discuss how we define the roadmap from point A to point B, now that we understand how to commit and set our goals, as well as assess the current landscape in which your company operates. So within defining that roadmap, we'll talk about how to establish standards, as well as, well, I guess I jumped the gun a little bit on how to engage your suppliers there, but I don't think I covered all of the secrets yet. So we'll definitely still have more to talk about there. So when we consider the things that we need to keep in mind for setting procurement standards, we want to focus on three key elements across internal alignment, having a strong operating model, and making sure that you're implementing good monitoring and evaluation methods. So if we think about internal alignment, I think one of the actual huge positives of sustainability is that it almost forces people across the organization to collaborate in ways that are extremely productive, and in instances where they might not have had the same level of visibility and collaboration into each other's operations. And the thing is, lack of an internal alignment can have a lot of negative impacts on your supply chain, as well as the upstream supply chain of your suppliers and the sustainability performance associated with all of that. For example, let's say your demand planning team is not in sync with your supply and production planning team. You might run into issues where there are last minute order quantity changes that can create significant time pressures that then place a lot of pressure on working conditions of your suppliers, where they might be forced to increase worker overtime schedules to meet compressed timetables. They might be forced to cut corners to comply with manufacturing requests from the company that weren't foreseen. So we can see that this lack of alignment can actually result in underperformance on sustainability issues. And when you're looking at that internal alignment, you want to make sure that you have internal alignment across not only the different functions of your organization, so horizontally, but also vertically at the different hierarchy levels within the organization. So from a governance and oversight perspective, how do you set appropriate standards for executive leadership and the board of directors? How do you make sure that the teams who are overseeing the work are communicating, as well as making sure that the people on the ground are aware of the sustainability goals, aware of the internal direction that the organization wants to take, and that the implementation by the people on the ground is actually happening to realize the goals that you're setting in the first place. So that's internal alignment. And sort of segueing into how we consider the operating model, we want to think about sort of 5 key factors here, where we have our capabilities, our roles and responsibilities, the governance structure, the KPIs and metrics that you're using to measure success, as well as how you're embedding those technologies, tools, and insights. So that oversight and support are crucial in setting the correct tone and direction for supply chain sustainability. But you also want to make sure that you're setting up an operating model that is consistent with your company's operating context and accurately measuring the goals that you want to accomplish. So then you sort of get into your monitoring and evaluation methods. And here you sort of have 2 key methods of engaging with suppliers and sort of getting that data from outside your organization. So number 1 is supplier self-assessments. This is one of the most common ways we see, partially because it's sort of the path to least resistance, a good way to get 80% of what you need with 20% of the effort. We're always looking at the 80-20 rule, or at least I am. And I don't want to say it's just because I'm lazy. Let's say it's because I'm efficient. But when we look at supplier self-assessments, many companies will invite suppliers to self-assess and self-report their sustainability performance, either as an initial screen when selecting suppliers. So maybe when you're in the midst of doing an RFP, you might use it as like a criteria for your supplier selection. Alternatively, you might do it when you're just doing an overall risk analysis, identifying which suppliers might require close attention or which suppliers you might want to collaborate with. For example, suppliers that you know that have really high ESG impact, that have a lot of spend within your organization, those are your keystone priority suppliers that you want to maybe identify for supplier self-assessment, and maybe even greater collaboration with them. So beyond self-assessment, there's a lot of cool work that you can do with co-investment with people in your value chain, as well as in general, self-assessments in general are just a good starting point to cover a significant portion of your supplier base in a relatively short time frame. But if you're trying to get a layer deeper, validate the data that you're receiving, ensure that the data that the suppliers are reporting is consistent with the way that others are reporting it, with what is generally accepted. You can also do audits. So traditionally, audits are used as almost like an on-site evaluation of supplier performance against a company's policies and expectations. They're a little bit more rigorous. They're a little bit more in-depth. They usually cost a little bit more too. But at the same time, they're able to provide that assurance and verification that that's what's being reported is actually what is happening. I personally have typically seen audits used to validate compliance with labor laws and labor standards. That's typically where I've seen it used the most, but more and more, you'll start to see those audits being used to validate emissions reporting data, water use and land use, as those issues become more prevalent across the groups of stakeholders that we've consistently referenced, investors, customers, employees, and communities. In addition, if we take a look at the, like supplier self-assessments, there are a lot of really useful templates through publicly available reporting frameworks that exist. We'll talk about those a little bit more in depth in a little bit too. But For example, I think the UN SDG has like a publicly available reporting framework that companies can report through. If you're encouraging your suppliers to report through, for example, the Climate Disclosure Project, CDP, they have a very generally applicable framework. Some companies will request reporting through SASB, which has specific industry frameworks that capture, hey, in a typical industry, based on a company's operations, what are going to be the typical material and salient ESG impacts. So a lot of potential with supplier self-assessments, a lot of potential with audits as well for monitoring and having those evaluation methods to get that visibility beyond the scope of your internal organization. So if we also talk about some considerations for how we actually engage those suppliers beyond asking them to fill out a survey to report on their performance, we talked about how do we collaborate with those suppliers. So how do you work with them to create a corrective action plan for achieving compliance and alignment with your goals? If a supplier is a priority supplier and they're underperforming on ESG, well, you're not exactly just going to kick them to the curb. It's more beneficial for both parties to work together to see how you can accomplish those mutual goals across sustainability and in turn across business performance, right? How can you encourage improvements through regular communication, making sure that as you're engaging suppliers, it's not just a one-way, hey, we need data and improvement from you, but it's a two-way street so you can really understand how you can add value to each other's organizations. That's a crucial part of sustainable value chain, in my opinion. When you look at how to actually incentivize suppliers to kind of move towards the goals that you've set, you kind of have different drivers from rewards versus penalties, the classic carrot or the stick, as well as financial versus non-financial incentives. So this might take the form of contract clauses saying, hey, if you meet certain reporting requirements or ESG improvement KPI, there are rebates available. Is an example of something that I've seen implemented that would fall under the top right quadrant of financial support. Alternatively, you can have performance, you can have penalties for non-compliance. You typically see those, especially if suppliers are not compliant from like a labor perspective, or especially from key regulatory perspectives, to cover your risk from that perspective. There are also, again, a lot of opportunities for co-investment and creative collaboration strategies to engage your suppliers in a way that creates value for you and for them. But some tips for strong engagement include establishing trust, using tested communication strategies. So these might be, publicly available survey and reporting to make sure that companies can not only report to you what their emissions and what their ESG impacts are, but also so they can publicly start making that data available and really start autonomously taking forward their own sustainable value chain transformation journey. You can also make sure that you're requesting anonymous feedback as well as in-person feedback. Again, feedback is really important. Sustainable value chain transformation is an iterative journey, and the only way you can get there is by continuous transformation. It is not a one and done implementation type deal, as well as making sure you're closing that feedback loop. So based on that feedback, how are you actually responding and using it to adapt your processes that you've put in place, the systems that go within and beyond your organization, and making sure to engage relevant stakeholders appropriately. So there's actually a really good question in the chat or in the Q&A about how do we gather the right data? How do we get baseline data? How do we understand what data is important to focus on? This is actually going to be, not to be a tease, but this is actually going to be covered in sort of the next deep dive on measurement and analytics. But at a high level, when you're looking at how do you set boundaries, how do you understand what information you should be capturing, how do you sort through the noise of, hey, there's a million things you could be measuring on sustainability, but what is actually important to measure and what can your organization actually impact? You basically want to look at two crucial factors and kind of work your way down several levels of questioning. where it's sort of, hey, does the thing we are measuring have significant impacts from our business, from our value chain? As well as two, do we have the ability to significantly influence those impacts? And those sort of filter into various layers of quantitative as well as qualitative data. So you can have performance data around the quantity of emissions that your value chain and your suppliers might be creating. But you might also have narrative reporting on issues and dilemmas that provide crucial qualitative context to really give the full picture across what the state of your sustainable value chain looks like, but making sure you have those different data inputs to really truly understand the landscape, the goals, and the progress towards those goals that you're doing. This also helps you get a good sense of, hey, what do you need to report versus, hey, maybe what can you sort of deprioritize. Covering that question on the chat a little bit too, someone asked about how certain industries like professional services might have less baseline data than other industries. There are actually a lot of publicly available reporting, especially on larger companies. They feel more pressure to report against those frameworks and standards. But for example, the Climate Disclosure Project has a lot of those sustainability reports broken out. Companies will also publish their own sustainability reports with valuable information. Once you start trying to look at industry-specific data and baselines, it becomes a little bit more difficult because that typically involves like aggregating a lot of data and understanding how the size and operating context of specific companies might influence like that data. For example, like how do you normalize a company's quantitative data and their, like ESG impact data in light of their size and scope, in light of their growth, et cetera. And that definitely gets more into the territory of like pay-to-play databases and services that various firms and companies might offer. So yeah, that's a little bit about getting the right data. Again, there will be a deep dive into that in the next session on measurement analytics. So taking a quick look at this case study from Ericsson. If Ericsson set its supplier climate targets for 350 high emitting and strategic suppliers to set their own 1.5 degree aligned climate targets. This is an instance where Ericsson was able to engage its high priority suppliers and say, hey, we've set these goals. This is crucial for our organization. We want y'all, our suppliers, to be aligned to the same goals. So set those GHG emissions targets and make sure you're making those commitments public. So like we can see, there are a lot of guidance and existing playbooks to help get you started on that journey for setting targets and helping your suppliers understand how they can embark on that journey too. I'll call out a couple that you see on the right-hand panel. Science-Based Targets Initiative that we've talked about, great way that has a methodology for calculating the different emissions impacts sources of an organization, as well as the CDP, which I've called out several times, which is a really wide database, probably the most commonly used for general public reporting of beyond emissions, overall sustainability for climate, deforestation, as well as water use. So I think we have another Menti now where we'll look at, turn it over to you all to see, where do you see tensions between the needs of your company and the wider needs of society? Yeah, and as we've said before, right, like a lot of these sustainability goals, well, when people think about sustainability goals, sometimes they have the misconception that, oh, those are mutually exclusive to achieving your profitability goals. But as we've said, as we've explained multiple times during the presentation, a lot of times those goals actually really go hand in hand. It's just a matter of redefining your decision-making framework and incorporating and embedding sustainability in your business process so that you are considering the full impact of your organization And really it helps drive, like this respondent said, full transparency across your organization, as well as, creating shareholder value through things like energy efficiency, resource efficiency, et cetera.
And this is a big one, Tab, too, when we think about timelines. I often see such a conflict between kind of quarterly reporting and the value and the impact that we're trying to create through sustainability initiatives. And so I know, the Unilever's decision not to report quarterly was such a big statement to the market to say what we're doing is more impactful than can be measured on a quarterly basis. And I think a lot of companies are under that pressure, and a lot of folks in sustainability are under that pressure to balance those. So I think it's a really, really important point.
Absolutely. Yeah, seeing a little bit about balancing ESG priorities with economic challenges, especially in the face of linear economic models, which might require a little bit more shifting of thought and long-term planning and strategy to, delinearize those models. But a lot of the times, profit maximization at the expense of ESG, I think a lot of times what people will end up realizing once they do those analyses within their organizations is that there's so many pieces of, let's not call them low-hanging fruit, but things that are mutually beneficial from a sustainability standpoint and also create heavy ROI from a traditional business value perspective. Not only in terms of maximizing profits, but also maximizing operational efficiency and maximizing the end-to-end visibility across your supply chain and across your organization. Cool. Why don't we go ahead and jump back to the presentation. I'll kick it back to CJ to talk about how we can implement that roadmap.
Perfect. So I know we're running a little short on time, so I'm gonna cruise through these a little faster than anticipated, but please, if there's a particular focus area for you, drop a question and we can take a pause and facilitate discussions, because we really want to make sure that this is most relevant to you all, while also respecting your time, of course. So when we think about implementation is the hard part, right? You've done all of this assessment and commitment, and you've done your planning, and you've started to define what that actually looks like and means in your company. But as you're thinking about implementing, there are some great kind of project planning takeaways that we're going to provide today. And then there's also some technologies that you can integrate to help facilitate this process and really just embed accountability into the investments and the actions that you're taking. So when we think about project planning, for sustainability, we kind of have 5, major driving principles for project management. And again, depending on your organization, I know you all had a sustainable organization module at first to kick it off. And I think that's so important because a lot of sustainability action and investment is really inhibited by the structure that sustainability is built into the organization. So, I think keeping that in mind and understanding the constraints of your environment, these can help to jump some of those hurdles that are just inherently there. So the first is having that compelling narrative. And really this starts in the commitment phase and it is reinforced in that assessment phase. So when folks are committing, do they know what they're committing to? Is that compelling to them? Are they excited, as you all are excited, about the goals that are being set? And do they have a narrative of what their role is? And that gets into the second one. It can't be an add-on. So as a chief procurement officer, I need to have this hat of, I'm not taking it off to then think about sustainability. I'm thinking about my responsibilities embedded with sustainability. Then the value-based and tracked accordingly, I think this is around accountability. And we're seeing a lot of organizations, when they're thinking about embedding sustainability, actually put both carrot and sticks in to an employee's performance so that they understand, hey, this is value-based projects, but we're tracking this and we do feel this has an impact on our business. So we're going to track it in a way that is equivalent to some of the other contributions that you're making. The fourth one is thinking about end to end. So this is, instead of having a lot of initiatives that you've determined are really vital to the company and kind of sending them out and acting as the command and control, how are you making sure that there is end-to-end visibility throughout the organization so you can create that story arc and that kind of narrative that wraps all of these things together? And this is particularly important in supply chains because oftentimes one arm doesn't talk to the other sort of thing. And so you as a sustainability professional, or you as someone who's really integrated in sustainability, can do an amazing job of starting to triangulate and connect things between silos so that you can both build off of each other's efforts, as well as stay informed about how others are making, really substantial changes in the way that they're operating their particular business function. And the fifth sort of principle we have around kind of implementation is thinking about technology, right? So when we're talking about assess, we really talked about that baseline data. So as you're implementing, be thinking about how the progress and the efforts are reflected in data. So not only does that hold you accountable to ensuring that you're taking the right approach, because oftentimes we might start down a path and say, this is having no impact whatsoever, and we need to pivot. So it's really vital that you're gathering data so that you can have kind of an agile approach to the way that you're tackling a certain topic. But on the other hand, you might find through collecting data that something's accelerating your progress much more quickly than you thought. And so you might want to channel more investment in that way. So it's critical as you're project managing that you're collecting that live data. You're not waiting till 3 years out to evaluate the performance of a certain program or particular project. And I want to make a note about segmentation of suppliers. So earlier Tab had made a reference to the 80-20 rule. And, I think it's a really, really helpful framework to think about where you send a majority of your kind of prioritized investment, right? Because you're going to see the biggest payout, you're going to see the biggest impact, you're going to see the biggest change. But I also want to advocate for the rest of us. So, oftentimes when we have a complex supply chain, you're talking about your big suppliers, but you're also talking about small suppliers, suppliers that might not have the same level of capability. They might not have the same capital available or resources or understanding. And so oftentimes when, you're thinking about implementation, if you build a program with a specific supplier in mind, you can miss certain operating contexts that's going to make it very difficult for certain suppliers to be compliant. So we kind of recommend that when you're setting your targets, you're also thinking about segmenting your suppliers so that you're designing different pillars of support and different attributes to programs that some folks are really going to need more support, but are just as vital to keeping your business afloat and to integrating sustainability into their operations as the folks that have that 80%. And one of the things, again, that's really critical here is thinking about how technology can be an enabler. So, while some folks may already have really robust reporting and they can immediately, start logging data onto the blockchain, some others might not have that same amount of capability. So it's really important to think about appropriate technology in this particular context. Now let's talk about a very cool technology. So traceability, I think when we think about traceability, oftentimes we first think about kind of food quality and standards, right? So the original application really was a quality control function. So if something goes wrong, you don't have to recall every single product out on the market. You have an ability to sort of identify and isolate where that problem product came from. Well, now we're seeing the concept of traceability as it relates to sustainability, and the potential of this to add a trusted element to what we say we're doing is really huge, and it's really exciting. So fundamentally, traceability is this ability to identify the entire life cycle of a product down to the ingredient level, and watch its progression through a variety of processes being transported from point A to point B, and maintaining that integrity, that chain of custody. So you understand whose hands metaphorically have touched a product along its life cycle. Now, it's one thing to collect that data and you have this great QR code that tells you where it's been, but then what do you actually do with that data, right? So I love this stat that 81% of CSOs are leveraging technology and they've got all these great databases full of it. But actually managing that and deriving insights from that is really difficult. And so, traceability can be one of those cases when you're looking at your product across a variety of processes. There's a great business case where you can actually capture efficiencies because you're getting real-time data about where that product is moving, how it's moving, and what you can do to improve. But we're also seeing this ability, and there's a variety of models. So you really have to think about the use cases of why traceability is so important to your company. But we're also seeing this additional benefit to start identifying these sustainability attributes and seeing how that translates then into the market. So for example, if you're doing something like a book and claim, or you're looking at product segregation, what does that do for your company in terms of gathering those actual insights? And a place to start here, and that we'll go through kind of a human rights case study. So a place to start here would be to look at the composition of your products and try and understand within that composition, where are there key sustainability topics that you really want to double click into, you really want to understand, and you want to make claims against. So for example, maybe palm oil makes up a critical piece of your product, and you know that supply chain has particular human rights violations. So you're identifying that risk within palm oil, you're understanding that we really want to prioritize human rights. And then you're able to think about what mitigation strategies, say signing up to the responsible RSPO, responsible sourcing palm oil something roundtable, to certify and to claim then that custody from the source of the smallholder all the way up the chain, and it carries through to your product. So that's just an example of what traceability can do for you, but also the warning of enacting something that is fairly expensive and fairly complex without having that end use case already built in from the start. Because we do see a lot of companies trying to figure out where they fit in this traceability story and how it's really going to bring true value to the company. And the case study here on Ralph Lauren, so they do have traceability, so they can track with a QR code. The manufacturer is actually sewing the tag into the shirt itself. And so for them, customers are able to have a quality assurance. So again, there's that kind of original piece of traceability, which is the quality assurance. And then the supply chain managers are also capturing those efficiencies. So this is a really strong example. And there are also examples of small businesses using this. Chilote is one of my favorite. They're a slipper company from Chile. And you're able to actually see who sewed the slipper, and they use a salmon skin upcycled. And you can actually see the fishery, the exact farm that salmon was from. So I think there's some really cool applications here with products, and I'm excited to see where the traceability journey is going. And I'm not sure in the nature of time if we want to maybe skip this Menti so that we're able to, yeah, perfect, get to the key takeaways. I'll hand it back over to Tab.
Sure, thanks for that, CJ. I'll try and zip through some of these key takeaways. So if we go to the next slide, basically, 5 key takeaways. Number one, acknowledge the complexity and the different questions, the different pain points that might be felt at different points in the supply chain process and by your different stakeholders. Number two is bring people around the table. Collaboration is key. Sustainability helps facilitate it. It adds a lot of value to your organization beyond just sustainability as well. Develop feedback mechanisms and communicate regularly, especially with your suppliers, with your internal organization. Like we said, it's an iterative process, and with your suppliers, it's a two-way street. So make sure that you're keeping those lines of communication open and you're accepting and willing to learn from that feedback. In general, too, that number 5, learning from others. See what you can learn from other companies where they've enjoyed success. See what you can learn from other best practices that you've seen implemented in your industry and beyond. So definitely across those 5 key takeaways. Hopefully we were able to illuminate those throughout the presentation today. And if we want to go to the next slide real quick, you've sort of learned how to interweave these topics with the transformation process. Congratulations. This was a Sustainable Value Chain 101. You've already covered circularity in a previous session. I believe that's been recorded. In the next session, we'll focus on post-implementation on measuring, analytics, and communicating.